Okay, so um, continuing on from the issue of taking refuge in false things, and then the last brief talk was in the context of taking refuge in healthy things, and we talked about spiritual bypassing and using seemingly healthy activity, particularly spiritual or Buddhist practice, as an aversionary tactic to what we need to face and engage. Um, Today's brief talk is in reference to the subtle refuge. And I spoke already in the first false refuge talk about how what the subtle refuge is we attach to a story, a narrative of that rationalizes and justifies um, our pursuing of false refuge, and that we actually find a security in that. It gives us something to latch onto, and that gives us a feeling of comfortability. And something I haven't spoken about yet, and I'll get more in depth in a future talk, is conditionality. And conditionality deals with the different conditions that create the experience that we come to know as the self. So I don't want to get into that too much, but in relation to subtle refuge, what happens in conditionality is we create a fixed idea of ourselves, and we're completely identified with that and with those conditions that we're identifying with. And in terms of subtle refuge, what happens with that aspect of conditionality is as we um, as we deal with that construct of self that we created, many times it feels like we're really working hard and we're doing work in the name of transformation and liberation, and it's definitely well intentioned. But what happens is um, because the conditions we're identified with um, are temporary, um, they will change, and then the experience changes. But the work that we're doing that's so well intentioned keeps us stuck, identified with the construct. Um, and it's impossible to transform or liberate something that we really deep down hold a belief in is fixed and permanent. So how this relates to the subtle refuge is, we take subtle refuge, especially when it pertains to healthy things. That subtle refuge is the security that we find in the narrative or the false story we tell ourselves. And with conditionality, we have a false sense of the self. We identify ourselves and define ourselves um, with a wrong view. So the conditionality aspect that keeps us working and working and doing the work is part of that subtle refuge, which is a false narrative. And what that false narrative is in that subtle refuge um, is telling ourselves we're being a good Buddhist, we're working hard, we're doing well, we're doing the footwork, when really it keeps us spinning our wheels stuck um, in perpetuating the problem rather than being doing anything that eradicates it or frees us from it. So subtle refuge in terms of doing healthy things is simply doing creating that story and a narrative, an idea of self, that we're doing something positive for ourselves. We're being a good bit a Buddhist. We're being disciplined. We're partaking in practice. Um, but while we can understand where that security comes from, hey, we're being diligent Buddhist practitioners. Um, it guides us to take the false refuge in spiritual Buddhist teachings and activity as a false refuge.